A woman who gave away $200 million to strangers died sleeping on a urine-stained couch in torn nightgowns, denied medicine by the person who controlled her fortune. Brooke Astor spent 40 years transforming the Astor name from slum landlords into civic benefactors. She walked through housing projects in Chanel and furs, sat on folding chairs in community centers, demanded to see where every dollar went. Presidents came to her Park Avenue apartment for dinner. Museum boards sought her approval. Libraries carved her name in marble. She lived in a 14-room duplex penthouse at 778 Park Avenue and a 64-acre estate in Westchester County. At 105 years old, with an annual income of $5 to $6 million, she died in conditions prosecutors would later describe as squalor. The person responsible held power of attorney over everything she owned, her only son. The marble walls that had witnessed decades of New York's most elegant parties would become the barriers of a very different kind of imprisonment. But before that betrayal could happen, the fortune had to exist, and the Astor fortune began with a butcher's son. John Jacob Astor arrived in America in 1784 with 7 flutes and $25. He was 20 years old. Within 5 years, he had established himself in the fur trade, buying pelts from Native American trappers and shipping them to Europe and China. The profits were extraordinary. A beaver pelt purchased for $2 in upstate New York sold for $20 in London. By 1795, Astor had accumulated enough capital to shift his focus. He began purchasing Manhattan real estate at prices that seemed absurd to his contemporaries. Raw land north of Houston Street, undeveloped blocks in what would become Greenwich Village, farmland where the Upper West Side would eventually rise. He understood something other merchants missed. New York City was not simply growing, it was becoming the commercial center of a nation that would soon dominate global trade. When John Jacob Astor died in 1848 at age 84, he was worth approximately $20 million, making him not just America's first multimillionaire, but the wealthiest person in the country. His fortune exceeded the federal treasury. The fortune passed through generations of Astors, each heir expanding the holdings while society whispered about the slum tenements that generated much of the income. The family name became synonymous with both wealth and exploitation. Astor-owned buildings in the Five Points neighborhood housed thousands of immigrants in conditions that reformers called criminal. In 1912, the family's trajectory changed in a single night. John Jacob Astor IV, the richest man in America, boarded the RMS Titanic in Southampton with his pregnant 19-year-old wife, Madeline. They were returning from an extended honeymoon in Egypt and Paris. Astor was 47 and recently divorced, a scandal that had consumed New York society for 2 years. On the night of April 14, 1912, Astor helped his wife into Lifeboat 4. He asked if he could join her given her condition. Second Officer Charles Lightoller refused. Women and children first. Astor's body was recovered a week later by the cable ship Mackay Bennett. He had been crushed by the forward funnel. His son Vincent, waiting at the family estate in Rhinebeck, New York, learned he had inherited approximately $85 million. He was 20 years old. Vincent Astor was shaped by a childhood that money could not soften. His father was cold, distant, more interested in inventions and hotels than in his son. His mother, Ava Willing Astor, was beautiful, vain, and largely indifferent to parenting. Vincent was sent to boarding schools where he was mocked for his name and bullied for his awkwardness. He developed a stammer that plagued him for life. Friends later described him as a man of moments of deep melancholy interspersed with bursts of manic energy. Unlike previous Astors who treated their slum properties as simply another asset class, Vincent sold the tenement buildings. The family's reputation as slumlords embarrassed him. He reinvested in shipping, hotels, and more reputable real estate ventures. In 1948, at age 56, he established the Vincent Astor Foundation with a mission to alleviate human misery. The foundation began distributing grants to hospitals, libraries, and social service organizations. Fortune magazine in 1957 estimated his wealth at between $100 and $200 million. He owned Ferncliff, a 2,800-acre estate in Rhinebeck. He served as chairman of Newsweek magazine, He collected rare books and financed archaeological expeditions. By the late 1950s, Vincent was ill. He drank heavily, scotch before lunch, wine with dinner, brandy afterward. He smoked 3 packs of cigarettes daily. His doctors warned him repeatedly. He ignored them. His second wife, Mary Minnie Cushing, understood that the end was approaching. She was a practical woman from a practical family. She told Vincent she would find him a suitable replacement, but only if he agreed to divorce her properly and provide adequate financial settlement. The first candidate Minnie suggested was a socialite known for her wit and beauty. She visited Vincent at his apartment, spent an afternoon in conversation, and afterward told Minnie she would not marry him even if he were the last man on earth. She did not even like him, she explained. He was too difficult, too morose, too demanding. The second candidate was a recently widowed woman named Brooke Russell Marshall. She had already buried 2 husbands. She would bury a third. Roberta Brooke Russell was born March 30th, 1902 in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, the only child of John Henry Russell, Jr., a Marine Corps officer who would eventually rise to become the 16th Commandant of the Marine Corps. Her mother, Mabel Howard Russell, came from a respectable but not wealthy family. Brooke's childhood was spent following her father's military assignments: 2 years in Peking, China, 18 months in Santo Domingo during the United States occupation of the Dominican Republic, a year in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, time in Panama, Hawaii, and the Philippines. She attended approximately 7 different schools, never staying long enough to form lasting friendships. She learned to adapt quickly, to charm strangers, to read social situations with precision. These skills would serve her for 9 decades. At age 17, while living in Washington, D.C., Brooke met John Kuser at a debutante ball. Kuser was the heir to a New Jersey utility fortune. His father, Colonel Anthony Rudolph Kuser, had made millions in public transportation and energy. The young man was handsome, confident, and appeared to be a perfect match. They married in 1919. The marriage revealed itself as catastrophic almost immediately. Kuser was an alcoholic. He was physically violent. He broke Brooke's jaw while she was 6 months pregnant, striking her during an argument about money. The Kuser family, enormously wealthy but without social refinement, treated Brooke with disdain. Years later, reflecting on that period, she would tell friends it was the worst time of her life. "I learned about terrible manners from the family of my first husband," she said. "They didn't know how to treat people." A son, Anthony Dryden Kuser, was born in 1924. Shortly after the birth, Kuser he pushed Brooke down a flight of stairs at their estate. She survived. The marriage limped forward for 6 more years, held together by social expectation and Brooke's lack of financial independence. In 1930, Brooke obtained a divorce in Reno, Nevada, the quickest route to legal separation at the time. She was 28 years old with a 6-year-old son and no source of income. In 1932, Brooke married Charles Henry Marshall, known to everyone as Buddy. He was a magazine editor at House and Garden, part of the Condé Nast publishing empire. The marriage was, by all accounts, a genuine love match. Buddy earned a modest salary. They lived in a small apartment. They entertained friends with home-cooked dinners and conversation. For 20 years, Brooke experienced what she would later describe as the happiest period of her life, not despite the lack of wealth, but perhaps because of it. She worked briefly at House and Garden alongside her husband. She began writing short pieces about design, about domestic life, about the art of entertaining on a budget. She discovered she had talent. In 1952, Buddy died suddenly of a heart attack. He was 56. Brooke was 50 years old, widowed for the second time, and financially precarious once again. Within a year, through mutual friends in New York social circles, she was being introduced to Vincent Astor. Vincent's proposition was straightforward. He needed a wife who could manage his social obligations and represent the Astor name with grace. She needed financial security. Friends later acknowledged openly that Brooke married Vincent for practical reasons. Louis Auchincloss, the novelist who moved in Astor social circles, remarked years later that he wouldn't respect her if she hadn't married for money. It was the sensible thing to do. The marriage was formalized on October 8, 1953, in a private ceremony. Brooke was 51. Vincent was 61. The marriage was often miserable. Vincent was suspicious of everyone's motives. depressed about his health and antisocial by nature. He preferred reading in his library to attending parties. He criticized Brooke's friends as frivolous. He monitored her spending obsessively, but he also recognized her gifts. She could work a room in ways he never could. She remembered names, birthdays, personal details. She made people feel important. Vincent began sending her to represent the Astor Foundation at events he didn't want to attend. She visited hospitals, libraries, community centers. She took notes. She asked questions. She discovered she was good at philanthropy, not just writing checks, but understanding what money could accomplish. The union lasted barely 6 years. On February 3, 1959, Vincent Astor died of a heart attack at age 67. The death occurred at their apartment at 120 East End Avenue. Brooke was with him. His half-brother John Jacob Astor VI immediately filed a lawsuit claiming Vincent had been mentally incompetent when he signed his will. The legal challenge focused on Vincent's final months. He had been hospitalized multiple times. His drinking had worsened, and Brooke, the lawsuit noted specifically, had brought him liquor while he was in the hospital dying, a detail meant to paint her as manipulative and mercenary. The lawsuit was settled for $250,000 paid to the half-brother. The rest, approximately $67 million in Vincent Astor Foundation assets that Brooke now controlled as president, plus her personal $60 million trust, remained hers to deploy. She was 57 years old, and she would spend the next 38 years deploying that fortune with a precision and purpose that would transform the Astor legacy. Brooke Astor wore Chanel suits and fur coats to visit homeless shelters in the South Bronx. She insisted on touring every facility the Vincent Astor Foundation funded. She would not write a check without seeing where the money would go. From 1959 through 1997, she served as president of the foundation, personally directing the distribution of approximately $200 million. She sat on folding metal chairs in housing project community rooms, her Chanel suit incongruous against the scarred linoleum floors. She walked through the Bronx Zoo in heels, demanding to know which animal enclosures needed renovation. She visited libraries in Harlem and asked librarians what their neighborhoods needed. She insisted on seeing every program her foundation funded, not a summary report, but the actual work being done. This approach was revolutionary for philanthropists of her era. Most wealthy donors attended gala dinners and mailed checks. Brooke showed up unannounced. Major beneficiaries included the New York Public Library, where she served as trustee from 1959 forward. Under her guidance, the Astor Foundation restored the main reading room, renovated branch libraries in underserved neighborhoods, and funded children's literacy programs. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, where she joined the board in 1963, received funding for acquisitions, conservation work, and educational programming. Carnegie Hall received money for restoration after the building had been threatened with demolition in the early 1960s. The Animal Medical Center received funding for equipment and research. The Bronx Zoo received money for habitat improvements. The New York City Parks Commission received grants for playground equipment and green space restoration in poor neighborhoods. She directed over $500,000 to Bedford-Stuyvesant, a predominantly black neighborhood in Brooklyn, for housing renovation and small business development, remarkable for a wealthy white woman in the 1960s. Her motto, borrowed from Thornton Wilder's play The Matchmaker, became famous and was repeated constantly. Money is like manure. It's not worth a thing unless it's spread around. She meant it literally. She believed wealth was a public trust, not a private treasure. In 1998, at age 96, President Bill Clinton awarded Brooke the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor. The ceremony was held at the White House. Brooke, in a wheelchair by then, wore one of her signature Chanel suits, this one in pale pink. Clinton praised her decades of service to New York City and her transformation of American philanthropy. By 1997, at age 95, Brooke closed the Vincent Astor Foundation. She had given away nearly everything Vincent Astor had left her to distribute. The foundation had accomplished its mission. What remained was her personal fortune, the $60 million trust Vincent had left her directly, the Park Avenue apartment, the Westchester estate, art collected over 5 decades, jewelry, furniture, and the social capital of being the most beloved philanthropist in New York City. Standing between her and all of it was her only son, the son she had born at age 22 to a man who had broken her jaw, the son who had been sent away to boarding schools by her second husband. The son Vincent Astor had forbidden her from seeing for 6 years, the son who had watched her give away a fortune for nearly 4 decades while he struggled to pay his own bills. The apartment at 778 Park Avenue occupied the entire 16th floor and most of the 15th. The building, designed by Rosario Candela, had been completed in 1931 during the Art Deco boom. It was considered one of the finest residential buildings in Manhattan. Brooke's duplex contained 14 rooms, 5 bedrooms, 4.5 bathrooms, 6 terraces overlooking Park Avenue and Central Park. The interior design was handled by Sister Parrish, one of the most sought-after decorators in America. Albert Hadley, Parrish's partner, created the famous red-lacquered library, a room that would appear in countless magazine spreads over the decades. Chilled Hassam's painting flags. Fifth Avenue hung prominently above the fireplace in that library, surrounded by Qing Dynasty furniture and a jade and diamond Cartier clock valued at over $50,000. The painting showed Fifth Avenue during World War I draped in red, white, and blue flags, American, French, and British, a celebration of the Allied cause. Brooke had purchased it in the 1970s and considered it one of her most important possessions. 19th-century dog portraits covered the walls throughout both properties. Brooke was obsessed with paintings of aristocratic dogs, mostly spaniels, setters, and hounds painted by British artists between 1840 and 1910. Her collection numbered over 40 paintings and was considered one of the finest private holdings of dog portraiture in America. She wrote about it extensively. In 1982, she published an essay in Architectural Digest titled Brooke Astor on the Pleasures of Collecting, describing her passion for these images of beloved pets captured in oil. The collection became so socially significant that other wealthy collectors began competing to acquire similar works. Sotheby's and Christie's auction houses noted increased prices for dog portraits throughout the 1980s and 90s, a trend they attributed directly to Brooke's influence. Holly Hill sat at 298 Scarborough Road in Briarcliff Manor, approximately 30 miles north of Manhattan in Westchester County. The stone mansion was built in 1927 by architect William Adams Delano for attorney Hubert Templeton Rogers. Delano was one of the most prestigious residential architects in America, known for his country estates for wealthy families. The house was originally named Westcora, a combination of Westchester, Scarborough, and Rogers. When Brooke purchased the property in 1964 for approximately $600,000, she renamed it Holly Hill, after the holly bushes planted throughout the grounds. The estate encompassed 64.5 acres. The main house contained 13 bedrooms and measured approximately 10,000 square feet. Built from Pennsylvania fieldstone, it featured multiple fireplaces, leaded glass windows, and a grand entrance hall with a sweeping staircase. Outside, sweeping lawns descended toward woods. Formal gardens designed by landscape architect Marion Kruger Coffin featured over 10,000 daffodils that bloomed each spring. There were both indoor and outdoor swimming pools. Multiple stone outbuildings housed equipment and staff quarters. Views from the upper floors overlooked the Hudson River Valley. This was where Brooke wanted to die, among gardens, surrounded by beauty, with her dogs. Maintaining both properties required enormous resources. 778 Park Avenue required a staff of 3, a cook, a maid, and a butler who managed the household. Holly Hill employed a groundskeeper, a gardener, multiple housekeepers, and Chris Ely, who served as estate manager. Property taxes on Holly Hill alone exceeded $150,000 annually. The Park Avenue apartment's monthly maintenance fees approached $20,000. The art and furniture required insurance policies worth millions. This was the machinery of wealth that Brooke had maintained for decades. The Park Avenue apartment was where presidents came for dinner, where museum directors sought approval, where social power was exercised. Holly Hill was where Brooke walked her dogs and planted bulbs and read in the sun. The person she trusted most to maintain all of this, the person who held power of attorney over every dollar, every property, every decision, had been watching her spend his inheritance for nearly 40 years. Brooke Astor was out every day for lunch and out almost every night until she reached her late 90s. Her social calendar was managed by her personal secretary, who maintained a leather-bound appointment book that was consulted daily. Through her 90s, she maintained an astonishing schedule. The Reagans, Ronald and Nancy, were regular guests at 778 Park Avenue during the 1980s. The Kissingers, Henry and Nancy, came for dinner at least twice a year. Oscar and Annette de la Renta, the fashion designer, and his wife, were among Brooke's closest friends. Barbara Walters, then at the height of her career in television journalism, later recalled that being invited to Brooke's apartment was the ultimate social achievement in New York. "If Brooke Astor came to your house for dinner, that was a very big compliment," Walters said in a television interview after Brooke's death. "And if you were invited to her house, it was even a bigger compliment. You knew you had arrived." A typical weekday for Brooke in the 1980s and 90s followed a precise pattern. She rose at 7. Her maid brought breakfast on a tray, toast, soft-boiled eggs, tea. She read 3 newspapers: the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Daily News. By 9:30, she was dressed, usually in one of her Chanel suits, pearls, matching shoes, and handbag. Her secretary arrived at 10 to review the day's schedule. At 11:30, her driver brought the car around. She lunched at a restaurant or club almost every day: Le Cirque, the Colony Club, the Knickerbocker Club. After lunch, she often attended board meetings for the various institutions she supported. She returned home by 4, changed for dinner, and was out again by 7 for an event, a party, a benefit gala. She rarely returned before 11. This schedule continued into her mid-90s. Holly Hill served as her weekend retreat. She would arrive Friday afternoon and remain until Monday morning. The estate was her sanctuary, a place where social obligations could be temporarily set aside. She walked the grounds daily with her dogs. She supervised the gardening, often getting down on her knees to plant bulbs herself, despite her age. She entertained small groups for lunch on the terrace. Friends recalled intimate gatherings of 6 or 8 people, sitting in the shade of old oak trees, drinking white wine, discussing books and politics. Chris Ely, who managed the estate, became one of her most trusted employees. He had worked for Brooke since the 1950s, first as a butler at the Park Avenue apartment, then as estate manager at Holly Hill. He oversaw the maintenance staff, managed the household budget, and served as Brooke's liaison to contractors and vendors. He was devoted to her. Brooke had what photographs couldn't fully capture, what one contemporary described as star power. She possessed a charm and presence that made whoever she was speaking to feel like the most important person in the room. She remembered details from previous conversations. She asked follow-up questions that showed genuine interest. She laughed easily and told stories well. This was not performance or artifice. Friends insisted it was genuine. She truly enjoyed people. She collected those 19th-century dog paintings obsessively, but she also wrote about them. Beyond the Architectural Digest essay, she contributed entries to art catalogs and wrote the foreword for William Secord's comprehensive study, Dog Painting 1840 to 1940, published in 1992. Her own memoir, Footprints, published in 1980, chronicled her early life and her marriages. A second memoir, Patchwork Child, appeared in 1993 and focused on her nomadic childhood following her father's military career. She maintained this extraordinary pace, the social schedule, the board meetings, the writing, the philanthropy, into her late 90s. A feat of stamina and will that astonished everyone who knew her. But stamina eventually fails. Memory begins to slip. Small things at first, forgetting where she placed her reading glasses, asking the same question twice in an hour. Then larger gaps, struggling to remember the names of longtime friends, confusion about what day it was. And in 2000, at age 98, Brooke Astor was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. The diagnosis was private. Her doctors informed her family. The person managing her finances, the person who held power of attorney over everything she owned, heard the diagnosis and understood what it meant. Anthony Dryden Marshall had waited decades. The waiting was over. Anthony Dryden Marshall was born in 1924, the only child of Brooke's first marriage, delivered by a woman whose jaw had been broken by her husband while she carried him. His father, John Kuser, had pushed pregnant Brooke downstairs during another violent episode. Anthony's early memories were of a household filled with tension, shouting, and his mother's fear. After the divorce in 1930, Anthony rarely saw his mother. She had neither custody nor adequate funds to fight for it. When Brooke married Buddy Marshall in 1932, her new husband made his position clear. The boy was an unwelcome reminder of Brooke's first marriage. Anthony was 8 years old. Buddy virtually banished him to boarding schools and summer camps. Anthony spent holidays with the Kuser family in New Jersey, where his alcoholic father ignored him and his paternal grandparents treated him with cool formality. In 1942, at age 18, Anthony changed his surname from Kuser to Marshall. He later claimed it was out of admiration for his stepfather, but friends suspected it was to escape the Kuser name and everything associated with his father. When Brooke married Vincent Astor in 1953, the situation worsened. Vincent forbade Brooke from maintaining contact with her son. Vincent was childless, disliked children, and saw Anthony as a financial liability, someone who might make claims on Brooke's eventual inheritance. For 6 years, from 1953 until Vincent's death in 1959, Brooke had virtually no contact with Anthony. She missed the births of his twin sons, Philip and Alexander, born in 1953. She missed their early childhoods. By the time Vincent died and Brooke reconnected with her son, Philip and Alexander were 6 years old. They barely knew their grandmother, and they barely knew their father. Philip and Alexander would later describe Anthony as distant and formal throughout their lives. He was not physically abusive like his own father had been, but he was emotionally unavailable. He attended school plays and graduations, but he didn't attend practices or games. He asked about grades, but not about friendships or feelings. Both sons would eventually become estranged from him. Anthony's accomplishments were, by any objective measure, legitimate and impressive. He served in the United States Marine Corps during World War II and earned a Purple Heart after being wounded during the Battle of Iwo Jima in 1945. He spent several months in a naval hospital recovering from shrapnel wounds to his legs. After the war, he earned a degree from Princeton University, then joined the Central Intelligence Agency in its early years. He worked as an intelligence officer during the early Cold War, though the specifics of his assignments remain classified. In the 1960s, he transitioned to diplomatic service. He served as United States Ambassador to Madagascar from 1969 through 71, appointed by President Richard Nixon. He then served as Ambassador to Trinidad and Tobago from 1972 through 73, to Kenya from 1973 through 77, and to the Seychelles from 1976 through 77. His ambassadorships were generally regarded as competent but unremarkable. He managed diplomatic protocol well, but was not known for innovative policy work. After retiring from diplomatic service in 1977, Anthony returned to New York and became an investment banker. He worked for several firms on Wall Street, focusing on international investments and emerging markets. He also became involved in theater production. He invested in several Broadway shows and served as producer on multiple productions. In 1982, he won a Tony Award as a producer for Nicholas Nickleby, the Royal Shakespeare Company's acclaimed adaptation of the Dickens novel. The production won multiple awards that year. It was Anthony's greatest professional achievement and the accomplishment he was most proud of, but theatrical production is expensive. Mounting a Broadway show requires millions in upfront capital. Returns are uncertain. Most shows lose money. Anthony invested heavily in multiple productions throughout the 1980s and 90s. Several were critical successes but financial failures. He needed constant cash infusions to maintain his position in the theater world. 3 marriages and 3 divorces greatly reduced his personal net worth. His first marriage to Cheryl Parker produced his twin sons Philip and Alexander in 1953. That marriage ended in divorce in the early 1960s. Settlement costs were significant. His second marriage to Thelma Hugnall lasted from 1962 through 1992. 30 years. When that marriage ended after Anthony began an affair with Charlene Gilbert, the divorce settlement was substantial. Thelma received real estate holdings and a large cash settlement. In 1992, Anthony married Charlene Gilbert, his third wife. Charlene had previously been married to an Episcopal priest in Northeast Harbor, Maine. She was approximately 15 years younger than Anthony. Brooke called her Miss Piggy behind her back, a cruel reference to Charlene's appearance. In her will, Brooke would leave Charlene only jewelry and 2 coats, a deliberate insult. Beginning in the 1970s, Anthony took over management of Brooke's finances. She was in her 70s by then and traveling extensively for the Astor Foundation. She needed someone to pay bills, manage properties, handle tax filings. Anthony was her son. She trusted him. He was given power of attorney, legal authority to make financial decisions on her behalf. He was not an Astor, neither biologically nor through employment nor through Vincent's inheritance. Vincent had specifically excluded Anthony from his will. For 38 years, from 1959 through 1997, Anthony watched his mother distribute $200 million to strangers through the Astor Foundation, museums, libraries, parks, community centers, homeless shelters, schools he'd never heard of in neighborhoods he'd never visited. Meanwhile, his own finances were precarious. The divorce settlements had cost millions. The theater investments had lost millions more. His mother lived in luxury, a 14-room apartment, a 64-acre estate, while he struggled to maintain a modest lifestyle. The resentment built slowly, year by year, compounding like interest on a debt no one acknowledged. By the early 2000s, Anthony Marshall had managed his mother's finances for 3 decades. He held power of attorney over everything she owned, every property, every bank account, every stock portfolio. He had watched her give away a fortune he believed should have been his. And his mother, at 98 years old, could no longer remember what she had owned yesterday, much less what she had promised to museums and libraries decades before. Alzheimer's disease had stolen her memory, but it left her legally vulnerable in ways that created opportunity. Anthony began to test the boundaries. In 2002, Philip Marshall visited his grandmother at the Park Avenue apartment and noticed something was missing, an empty space on the library wall where a painting had hung for decades. Not just any painting, the child Hassam that had been the centerpiece of the red-lacquered library since the 1970s. Philip asked his grandmother where it had gone. She looked confused. She didn't remember. The painting was Flagg's Fifth Avenue by Child Hassam, also titled Up the Avenue from 34th Street, May 1917. The American Impressionist had painted it in 1917 during World War I. The image showed Fifth Avenue at 34th Street draped with red, white, and blue flags, American, French, and British banners celebrating the Allied cause during the war. The patriotic imagery resonated deeply with Brooke. The painting was one of her most treasured possessions. She had purchased it in the early 1970s for approximately $50,000. By 2002, similar Hassam works were selling for $5 to $10 million. Anthony told his mother she needed the money. Her annual income at the time was $5 to $6 million, more than enough to cover all expenses. But Brooke, in her confused state, couldn't challenge his assertion. The painting sold privately for $10 million to a buyer Anthony arranged. Anthony's commission was $2 million, 20%, far higher than standard art dealer commissions of 10%. The buyer was Gerald Peters' Gallery in Santa Fe, New Mexico, a dealer who specialized in American Impressionist works. Peters reportedly resold the painting shortly thereafter for $20 million, doubling his money in a matter of months. After the sale was complete, after the $2 million commission had been deposited in Anthony's account, Brooke asked her son a question that would later become infamous. "Now, can I buy dresses?" The question revealed everything. She thought she was poor. She thought the painting had to be sold to pay for necessities. She didn't understand she had millions in income and tens of millions in assets. The Alzheimer's had destroyed her capacity to track her own finances. The painting had been promised to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Brooke had told multiple friends and museum officials over the years that the Hassam would go to the Met after her death. Its whereabouts have been unknown since 2002. The Gerald Peters Gallery has refused to disclose the buyer. Art theft investigators believe it remains in a private collection, possibly outside the United States. In the 2012 estate settlement, after years of legal wrangling, the Met received $3 million in recognition of their claim, partial compensation for a painting worth at least $20 million. At trial in 2009, Anthony would be found not guilty on the charges specifically relating to the painting sale. The jury concluded that while the sale was questionable, prosecutors had not proven beyond reasonable doubt that it constituted theft. It was one of only 2 not guilty verdicts out of 16 counts. The painting disappeared from the library wall in 2002. Philip noticed, but he did not yet understand what it meant. He assumed his father had arranged the sale legitimately. Inside the Park Avenue apartment and at Holly Hill, conditions were deteriorating in ways that would remain hidden for 4 more years. The painting was gone. Soon, almost everything else would follow. What Philip Marshall did not know in 2002 was that the painting was the least of it. Anthony paid himself approximately $1 million annually as salary. The payments were drawn from Brooke's checking accounts and deposited directly into Anthony's personal accounts. There was no written employment agreement justifying this salary. There was no documentation of work performed. Alice Perdue, who worked in Brooke's business office managing accounting and bill payment, later testified at trial that she questioned the payments. Anthony told her he was entitled to compensation for managing his mother's affairs. Perdue also testified that Anthony diverted $1 million from Brooke's checking accounts into accounts designated for his theatrical productions. Money meant for household expenses and property maintenance was redirected to fund Broadway shows that Anthony was producing or investing in. Perdue documented the diversions, but felt she had no authority to stop them. Art and jewelry disappeared from both properties without Brooke's knowledge or consent. In addition to the Hassam painting, several smaller artworks vanished from the Park Avenue apartment. A 19th-century landscape valued at approximately $50,000. 2 Chinese porcelain vases from the Qing dynasty worth $75,000. A pair of 18th-century French chairs that Brooke had purchased at auction in the 1980s. Jewelry also disappeared. A diamond bracelet that had belonged to Vincent Astor's mother. A set of pearl earrings Brooke wore frequently in the 1990s, but that were never seen again after 2003. An emerald ring appraised at $100,000. Prosecutors would later estimate that art and jewelry worth over $2 million disappeared between 2002 and 2006. Some items were sold at auction under Anthony's name. Others simply vanished. At 778 Park Avenue, Brooke's living conditions deteriorated dramatically. She slept on a urine-stained couch in the library. Her bedroom was on the upper floor, but she had difficulty with stairs. Rather than arranging for a bedroom on the main floor or installing a stair lift, Anthony left her to sleep on the library couch. The couch was old, the upholstery torn in places, and it smelled. Nurses who cared for Brooke later testified that the urine smell was overwhelming. She wore torn nightgowns. The nightgowns had been expensive once, silk and lace from boutiques on Madison Avenue, but they were now decades old, yellowed, ripped at the seams. When nurses suggested buying new nightgowns, Anthony refused. Too expensive, he said. She ate bland leftovers. Anthony had fired the cook in 2004 to cut costs. Meals were prepared by household staff who were not trained chefs. Brooke ate reheated casseroles, plain chicken, overcooked vegetables. She had once dined with presidents. Now she ate food that would have embarrassed a boarding house. Meanwhile, her son collected $1 million annual salary. The apartment became filthy. Later testimony described it as very, very dirty. Dust accumulated on surfaces. Floors went unmopped. Bathrooms were not properly cleaned. Dog feces accumulated in corners and on carpets. Brooke had 2 dogs, small terriers that she loved. When the dogs had accidents, cleaning was delayed for days. A judge would later bar the jury from hearing specific testimony about the extent of the animal waste because it was deemed too prejudicial to Anthony. But nurses who cared for Brooke documented it extensively in their diaries. They photographed the conditions. The images would later be sealed by court order, but descriptions leaked it to the press. Prosecutors described the apartment as squalorous, a condition of filth and neglect, incompatible with dignity. Brooke's medication was reduced. She had prescriptions for multiple conditions: heart medication, blood pressure medication, medication to slow the Alzheimer's progression. In 2004, Anthony began questioning the necessity of certain prescriptions. He told Brooke's primary care physician, Dr. Howard Fillett, that the medications were too expensive. Dr. Fillett, a geriatric specialist who had treated Brooke for years, was shocked. He explained that the medications were necessary to maintain her health. Anthony insisted on reductions. Several prescriptions were discontinued against medical advice. Doctors' visits were curtailed. Brooke had previously seen Dr. Fillett monthly. Beginning in 2004, visits were reduced to every 3 or 4 months. When nurses urged more frequent visits, Anthony refused. Too expensive, he said. Her annual income remained $5 to $6 million, but she was being told she couldn't afford basic medical care. In January 2005, Anthony and Charlene closed Holly Hill entirely to cut costs. The decision was sudden. Staff were informed on a Friday that they should not report for work the following week. The estate was locked. The heat was turned down to 50 degrees to prevent pipes from freezing. Furniture was covered with sheets. Brooke had repeatedly told friends over the years that she wanted to die at Holly Hill. She loved the grounds, the gardens, the peace. She had told her lawyer to include language in her will specifying that she wished to spend her final days there. Anthony removed that option. The cost savings were minimal. Holly Hill employed a small staff and property taxes were fixed regardless of occupancy. The closure was symbolic more than financial. It represented Anthony's control. He could take away even the place she loved most. In 2005, Chris Ely was fired. He had served Brooke as butler and estate manager for over 50 years. He had managed the Park Avenue household staff in the 1950s and 60s. When Brooke purchased Holly Hill in 1964, Ely moved there to manage the estate. He supervised groundskeepers, gardeners, and maintenance workers. He managed Holly Hill's household budget and served as Brooke's liaison to contractors for repairs and renovations. He was devoted to her. He was also the person most likely to question Anthony's decisions. When Ely objected to closing Holly Hill, Anthony terminated his employment. No severance package was offered despite 5 decades of service. Brooke's longtime lawyer, Francis X. Morrissey Sr., was also replaced. Morrissey Sr. had handled Brooke's legal affairs since the 1970s. He was replaced by his son, Francis X. Morrissey Jr., who would later be convicted alongside Anthony. Morrissey Jr. was more willing to execute documents that served Anthony's interests. After his firing, Chris Ely maintained contact with the nurses who cared for Brooke. The nurses, Minette Christie, Pearline Noble, and 2 others who rotated shifts, kept detailed diaries documenting conditions over 4 years. They recorded everything: what Brooke ate, when medications were given or withheld, the condition of the apartment, conversations with Anthony, incidents of neglect. They photographed the urine-stained couch. They documented the dog feces. They recorded Brooke's confusion and distress. The diaries, totaling hundreds of pages, would become crucial evidence. But in 2005, Ely was simply gathering documentation, unsure what to do with it. He watched the woman he had served for 5 decades suffering, and he felt helpless. The will manipulation began with the 2002 original will. That document, executed while Brooke was still relatively lucid, designated her estate to be divided between family and charity after her death. Anthony would inherit approximately $14 million. The remainder, estimated at $70 to $80 million, would go to charitable institutions. The New York Public Library would receive 25%. The Metropolitan Museum of Art would receive 25%. Smaller amounts would go to Carnegie Hall, the Animal Medical Center, and various other organizations. Anthony would serve as co-executor alongside J.P. Morgan Chase Bank and Annette de la Renta. Then Anthony and Francis Morrissey, Jr. convinced Alzheimer's suffering Brooke to sign 3 codicils, amendments to the will. The first codicil, executed in 2003, designated Anthony as sole executor, removing J.P. Morgan Chase and Annette de la Renta from that role. This gave Anthony complete control over the estate's distribution. The second codicil, executed in 2004, redirected an additional $60 million from charity to Anthony. Under the new provisions, Anthony would inherit approximately $74 million. The New York Public Library's allocation was reduced from 25% to 8%. The Metropolitan Museum's allocation was reduced from 25% to 8%. The third codicil, executed in 2005, gave Anthony power to redirect Brooke's entire fortune to anyone he chose. The language specifically noted that Anthony could leave assets to his wife Charlene if he deemed it appropriate. All of this occurred while Brooke had been declared mentally incompetent in some medical and legal contexts. Nurses' notes documented her confusion. She could not remember what day it was. She could not remember conversations from an hour earlier. Yet Morrissey Jr. prepared documents for her signature, and Anthony witnessed her signing them. Charlene participated in meetings with lawyers drafting the codicils, despite not being named as a beneficiary in the documents themselves. She sat in the room while Morrissey Jr. reviewed provisions with Brooke. She asked questions about language. She suggested changes. Prosecutors would later argue that Charlene's presence was evidence of conspiracy. She knew what was happening and facilitated it even though she stood to gain nothing directly under the codicils. The benefit would come later, after Brooke's death, when Anthony could redirect the fortune using the powers the codicils had granted him. Meanwhile, social isolation became complete. Holly Hill remained locked through 2005 and 2006, the place Brooke loved most, denied to her. The apartment at 778 Park Avenue, once the center of New York social life, became a prison. Friends who called to invite Brooke to lunch or dinner were told she was unavailable. Anthony instructed household staff to screen calls and decline invitations on her behalf. When friends managed to visit, they noticed disturbing changes. Brooke seemed bewildered. She offered them gifts, jewelry, small artworks, unable to remember she had already given similar items to the same people months earlier. She couldn't remember names. Barbara Walters visited in 2005 and later told friends that Brooke had asked 3 times during a single conversation who Barbara was. The social calendar that had defined Brooke's life for 5 decades completely ceased. By 2006, she saw no one except nurses, Anthony, Charlene, and occasionally her grandsons Philip and Alexander, when they could arrange visits. John N. Hart Jr., a theatrical producer and longtime friend of Brooke's, recalled visiting Holly Hill during one of the brief periods when Anthony permitted access. Hart admired a Cecil Beaton portrait of Brooke in her bedroom, a striking image from the 1960s showing Brooke in an evening gown, elegant and confident. Brooke offered it to him. She insisted he take it. Hart recognized her confusion and declined politely. He later told investigators that Brooke had no idea what she owned anymore. She would have given away everything if Anthony hadn't been controlling access. By early 2006, Chris Ely had seen enough. He contacted Philip Marshall and shared the documentation the nurses had compiled. He described the conditions. He explained the financial irregularities he had witnessed before being fired. He told Philip that his grandmother was suffering and that something needed to be done. Philip Marshall faced a decision that would destroy his relationship with his father and save what remained of his grandmother's life. July 26, 2006. The New York Daily News ran a front-page headline, sooty in large, bold type, "Disaster for Mrs. Astor." The subheading read, "Brooke's grandson sues to take control from her son." The article detailed allegations of elder abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation. Philip Marshall had filed a lawsuit in Manhattan Supreme Court to remove Anthony as guardian and have Annette de la Renta appointed in his place. The petition alleged that Anthony had forced Brooke to live in squalor, denied her proper medical care, stolen artworks, and manipulated her will while she was mentally incapacitated. The allegations included specific details: the urine-stained couch, the torn nightgowns, the dog feces, the closed estate, the disappeared paintings. The Daily News article was devastating. It quoted sections of the legal petition. It included statements from nurses who had cared for Brooke. It reprinted portions of the nurses' diaries. Within hours, the story was picked up by national news outlets. Philip Marshall was a tenured professor of historic preservation at Roger Williams University in Rhode Island and a practicing Tibetan Buddhist. He was 53 years old, married with children, and had maintained a cordial if distant relationship with his father for decades. The decision to sue had been agonizing. He consulted with his brother Alexander. He consulted with his wife. He met with lawyers to review the evidence Chris Ely had provided. He knew that filing the lawsuit would destroy any possibility of relationship with his father. He also knew that doing nothing meant his grandmother would continue suffering. His stated goal was simple and repeated in multiple interviews after the lawsuit became public: get her back to the country. That's all it really boiled down to. He told reporters he merely wanted to provide his grandmother with the care, comfort, and dignity she deserved. He insisted he had no financial motive. He stood to inherit very little regardless of how the estate was distributed. On August 8, 2006, less than 2 weeks after the lawsuit was filed, the court granted temporary guardianship to Annette de la Renta. The decision was swift. The evidence Philip presented, the nurse's diaries, photographs of conditions, financial records showing unexplained transfers, was compelling enough for the judge to act immediately. The news leaked to the press almost immediately. Philip had not wanted publicity. He had hoped to resolve the matter quietly through the courts. But someone, probably someone working for Anthony, or someone at the court, tipped off reporters. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office took notice and launched a year-long criminal investigation. Prosecutors Robert Morgenthau and Elizabeth Lowy were assigned to the case. They began subpoenaing financial records and interviewing witnesses. In October 2006, Anthony settled the civil guardianship case. The terms were negotiated through lawyers over several tense weeks. Anthony agreed to return some money to Brooke's accounts, approximately $400,000. He returned several pieces of jewelry that had disappeared. He returned 2 paintings, though not the Hassam. He relinquished control over Brooke's finances. The power of attorney was revoked. J.P. Morgan Chase and Annette de la Renta were appointed as co-guardians. Anthony and Charlene gave up their positions as executors of the will. The 3 codicils Anthony had convinced Brooke to sign remained legally valid. The civil court lacked jurisdiction to void them. But Anthony's control was gone. In December 2006, a court-appointed evaluator issued a report concluding that while Anthony had exercised poor judgment and created uncomfortable living conditions, he had not technically committed elder abuse as defined by New York civil law. The report was narrow in scope. It focused only on whether civil guardianship standards had been violated. The criminal investigation continued separately. Criminal prosecutors had different standards and different evidence. The judge in the civil case ordered J.P. Morgan Chase to take immediate actions, replace the urine-stained couch immediately, buy new nightgowns, outfits, underwear, and accessories appropriate for a woman of Brooke's social standing, provide all necessary medications as prescribed by her physicians, ensure proper medical care with regular visits to Dr. Phillott, hire a professional cleaning service to restore the apartment to acceptable condition. Anthony's $2.3 million annual salary, a figure that shocked observers when it was revealed in court documents, was suspended. Holly Hill was reopened. Brooke returned to the estate she loved in late October 2006. Her final months were spent with family present, nurses attentive, and her beloved dog Girlsy at her side. The nurses who had documented the abuse now documented her care. She was given proper medications. She ate well-prepared meals. She sat in the gardens when weather permitted. She seemed, according to those caring for her, more peaceful than she had been in years. In July 2007, Philip photographed Brooke in a wheelchair on Holly Hill's lawns, surrounded by Philip, Alexander, and several great-grandchildren. She wore a light summer dress. The gardens behind her were in full bloom. Philip later described it as a perfect summer's day. On August 13, 2007, just after midnight, Brooke Astor died peacefully in her sleep at Holly Hill. She was 105 years old. Pneumonia was listed as the cause of death. Her lungs had filled with fluid over several days. Nurses had kept her comfortable with morphine. She did not suffer at the end. On August 17, 2007, her funeral was held at St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. The Gothic Revival Church, built in 1913, was one of New York's most prestigious houses of worship. Over 800 people attended. Henry Kissinger delivered a eulogy, praising Brooke's philanthropy and her transformation of the Astor legacy. Oscar de la Renta spoke about her friendship and her grace. Whoopi Goldberg, the actress and comedian whom Brooke had befriended in the 1990s, spoke about Brooke's kindness across racial and class lines. Jesse Norman, the opera singer, sang Amazing Grace. Mayor Michael Bloomberg attended, along with dozens of museum directors, library trustees, and social figures. Anthony sat in the front pew with Charlene. Philip and Alexander sat across the aisle. The 2 sides of the family did not speak. After the service, Brooke was buried at Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Tarrytown, New York, next to Vincent Astor. Her gravestone bore an epitaph she had chosen years earlier: I had a wonderful life. 3 months after Brooke Astor's death, on November 27, 2007, Anthony Marshall surrendered to authorities at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office on Hogan Place. He was 83 years old. He arrived with his lawyers, dressed in a dark suit, walking with difficulty. He was processed, fingerprinted and photographed for a mugshot that would appear on front pages across the country. The charges included conspiracy, grand larceny, and possession of stolen property. His co-defendant was his lawyer, Francis X. Morrissey, Jr., who was indicted on separate charges of conspiracy, scheming to defraud, forgery, and possession of forged instruments related to his role in preparing the codicils. The trial would consume 5 months and end with a verdict that surprised almost no one who had followed the case. The indictment against Anthony Marshall contained 16 counts. The lead charge was grand larceny in the first degree, which carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 1 year in prison. There were 5 additional counts of grand larceny in the second degree, related to specific thefts and financial transfers. 2 counts of criminal possession of stolen property in the second degree covered the artworks and jewelry that had disappeared. 2 counts of offering false instruments for filing in the first degree, errors related to tax documents and financial statements Anthony had submitted that concealed thefts. Scheme to defraud in the first degree covered the overall pattern of exploitation. 2 counts of conspiracy in the fourth degree and 1 count of conspiracy in the fifth degree charged Anthony with working with Morrissey to defraud Brooke. Francis X. Morrissey, Jr. faced 6 counts: conspiracy, scheming to defraud, forgery related to the codicils, and possession of forged instruments. The charges alleged that Morrissey had prepared documents he knew Brooke was mentally incapable of understanding and had participated in a scheme to enrich Anthony at Brooke's expense. The trial ran from April through October 2009, 19 weeks total, one of the longest criminal trials in Manhattan that year. Judge A. Kirk Bartley of Manhattan Supreme Court presided. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Joel Seidemann, who had specialized in elder abuse cases for over a decade. The defense team included Kenneth Warner, a prominent white-collar criminal defense attorney, and Frederick Haffetz, who handled the financial aspects of the defense. The trial was covered extensively by the New York Times, the New York Post, the Daily News, and national media outlets. Courtroom observers included journalists, law students studying elder abuse prosecution, and members of New York's social elite curious about the fate of one of their own. Judge Bartley made a crucial pretrial ruling that shaped the entire case. He barred testimony about physical and psychological abuse, limiting evidence to financial documents and financial crimes. Prosecutors had wanted to present testimony about the urine-stained couch, the torn nightgowns, the dog feces, the denial of medical care. Bartley ruled that such testimony was prejudicial and not directly relevant to the financial charges. The trial would focus exclusively on money, what Anthony took, how he took it, whether his actions constituted theft. Bank statements, wire transfers, and financial records dominated the proceedings. Prosecutors presented dozens of exhibits showing money flowing from Brooke's accounts to Anthony's accounts. They showed art sales where Anthony pocketed commissions. They showed the diverted theatrical production funds. They traced every dollar. Philip Marshall testified for 2 days. He described visiting his grandmother and finding the apartment filthy. He wanted to testify about dog feces accumulating in corners. But Judge Bartley barred that specific detail as too prejudicial. Philip could only say the apartment was very, very dirty. He described the missing Hassam painting. He described his grandmother's confusion. He described conversations where she didn't recognize him. He testified that when he asked his father about the painting, Anthony had told him it was none of his business. Under cross-examination, defense attorney Warner tried to portray Philip as motivated by inheritance. A grandson angry that his father was receiving money Philip believed should eventually come to him. Philip remained calm. He repeated that his only goal had been to ensure his grandmother's care and comfort. Alexander Marshall, Anthony's other twin son, also testified against his father. The testimony was brief, only a few hours. Alexander corroborated Philip's descriptions of conditions. He testified that both he and Philip had been kept away from their grandmother for long periods during 2004 through 2006. When they called to arrange visits, Anthony or Charlene made excuses. Their grandmother was sleeping. She wasn't feeling well. She had other commitments. Alexander also testified about his father's character. He described Anthony as distant and formal throughout their lives. When asked if he and his father were close, Alexander said no. The courtroom was silent. Both sons described a man who had been physically present during their childhoods, but emotionally absent. Chris Ely, the former estate manager, testified for an entire day. He described the systematic firing of longtime staff. He described Anthony's orders to reduce expenses at Holly Hill, even though Brooke's income was more than adequate. He described finding valuable items missing after Anthony's visits. He described his firing in 2005 after he questioned Anthony's decisions. He testified that he had loved Brooke like family and that watching her decline under Anthony's control had been unbearable. Under cross-examination, defense attorneys tried to suggest that Ely was a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. Ely responded calmly. He had no financial interest in the case. He simply wanted justice for a woman who had treated him with dignity for 5 decades. The nurses, Minette Christie and Pearline Noble, presented their diaries as evidence. 4 years of daily entries documenting Brooke's care and neglect. The diaries were meticulous. They recorded every medication given, every meal served, every visitor who came, every phone call made. They documented the deteriorating conditions. They noted when prescriptions ran out and Anthony refused to authorize refills. They noted when Brooke asked about Holly Hill and seemed distressed to learn it was closed. They photographed the couch, the nightgowns, the state of the apartment. Judge Bartley allowed the photographs into evidence over defense objections. The jury viewed them on large screens in the courtroom. Several jurors visibly reacted to images of the urine-stained couch. Alice Perdue, who had worked in Brooke's business office, testified about the $1 million diverted to theatrical productions. She brought financial records showing the transfers. She testified that when she questioned the diversions, Anthony told her it was his mother's wish to support the arts. Perdue testified that this explanation made no sense. Brooke supported the arts through the Astor Foundation, not through direct investments in Anthony's productions. Perdue had worked in financial administration for 30 years. She knew what proper bookkeeping looked like. These transactions were irregular. The defense strategy rested on 3 arguments. First, Anthony had legal power of attorney, granting him authority to make financial decisions, including giving himself raises and gifts. Second, Brooke was lucid when she signed the codicils and acted out of love for her son, wanting him to benefit from her estate. Third, Anthony believed Brooke wanted him to have the money. His subjective belief negated criminal intent even if his belief was mistaken. The defense called no witnesses. Anthony did not testify. His lawyers believed the prosecution's case was built on circumstantial evidence and that the burden of proof had not been met. They argued in closing statements that the prosecution wanted to criminalize family dynamics. A son managing his elderly mother's affairs, admittedly imperfectly, but not criminally. During Phillips and Alexander's testimony, courtroom observers noted Anthony's reactions. He hunched forward at the defense table, his head in his hands. He held his forehead with his trembling right hand, fingers pressed against his temples as if in pain. During breaks, when the jury was dismissed, he and Charlene sat red-faced on a bench in the hallway outside the courtroom. Tears trickled from their eyes. They held hands. They did not speak to anyone. Philip's testimony about his grandmother's condition, her confusion, her fear, her isolation, drove Anthony to visible tears in the courtroom. Several journalists noted this in their coverage. After the testimony, Anthony and Charlene stopped speaking to Philip entirely. When Philip approached them during a break, attempting to make peace, Anthony turned his back. Charlene told Philip he had destroyed the family. Philip walked away. On October 8, 2009, after 12 days of jury deliberation, the verdict was announced. The deliberations had been tense. The jury sent multiple notes to Judge Bartley asking for clarification on legal standards for theft, on the definition of incompetence, on whether power of attorney provided immunity from prosecution. The answers were technical and left much to interpretation. When the jury finally reached a verdict, the courtroom was packed. Anthony Marshall was convicted on 14 of 16 counts. He was found not guilty on 2 charges, the counts relating specifically to the Hassam painting sale, where the jury concluded prosecutors had not proven beyond reasonable doubt that the sale constituted theft, and 1 count of falsifying business records, where evidence was ambiguous. Francis X. Morrissey Jr. was convicted on all 6 counts, though 1 count would later be reduced to 5 on appeal, when an appellate court found one of the charges duplicative. Anthony faced a maximum of 25 years in prison, but a mandatory minimum of 1 year due to the first-degree grand larceny conviction. Sentencing was scheduled for December 21, 2009. In the weeks between conviction and sentencing, Anthony remained free on bail. He spent the time at home with Charlene, meeting with his lawyers to discuss appeals. On December 21, 2009, Judge A. Kirka-Bartley sentenced Anthony to 1 to 3 years in prison, close to the mandatory minimum but within the range permitted by law. The sentence reflected Anthony's age, his health, and the fact that he had no prior criminal record. Bartley noted that the crimes were serious and involved a profound betrayal of trust, but that lengthy incarceration of an 85-year-old man in declining health served no penological purpose. Anthony arrived at the sentencing hearing in a wheelchair with an oxygen tank attached. He was 85 years old. His Parkinson's disease had advanced significantly. His breathing was labored. Charlene pushed the wheelchair into the courtroom. The courtroom was again packed with journalists, observers, and Philip and Alexander Marshall sitting in the gallery. Anthony's lawyers advised him not to make a statement because appeals were planned. Anything he said could be used against him in appellate proceedings. As court officers prepared to take him into custody, Charlene leaned down and kissed Anthony on the forehead. She smoothed his hair. She said loud enough for those nearby to hear, "We'll always love each other. Always. Always." A court officer took the wheelchair handles from Charlene and rolled Anthony toward a side door that led to the courthouse holding cells. Charlene watched him disappear. She sat down heavily on a bench and wept. Anthony Marshall rolled out of the courtroom on December 21, 2009, a convicted felon sentenced to prison. He would not see the inside of a cell for nearly 4 more years. The appeals process stretched on. And while lawyers filed motions and argued before appellate judges, the question of what would happen to Brooke Astor's fortune remained unresolved. The appeals continued for 3.5 years. Anthony's attorneys filed multiple motions challenging the verdict. They argued jury instruction errors, claiming Judge Bartley had improperly explained the legal standards for theft and incompetence. They argued improper expert witness testimony, claiming prosecutors had been allowed to present medical testimony about Brooke's Alzheimer's that went beyond proper scope. They argued various procedural claims, including allegations of prosecutorial misconduct in grand jury proceedings. Each motion was briefed extensively. Each required oral arguments. The Appellate Division of the New York State Supreme Court heard arguments in 2012. In 2013, the court issued its decision. 1 second-degree grand larceny count was vacated on technical grounds related to overlapping charges. Otherwise, the conviction was affirmed. The court found no reversible error. The evidence, the appellate judges concluded, was overwhelming. The prison reporting date was finally set, June 21, 2013. Anthony's condition had deteriorated significantly in the years since sentencing. He was 89 years old with advanced Parkinson's disease. The tremor in his hands had worsened. He required medication every 4 hours to manage symptoms. He had congestive heart failure. His cardiologist submitted medical reports to the court stating that Anthony could die within months. He could not walk without assistance. He could not stand for more than a few seconds. He could not dress himself. He required help with basic activities of daily living. His lawyers filed motions requesting that the sentence be commuted to house arrest given his medical condition. The motions were denied. Judge Bartley ruled that medical parole existed as an option after incarceration began, but that medical conditions did not exempt someone from serving their sentence. On June 21, 2013, Anthony arrived at Fishkill Correctional Facility in Beacon, New York. It was a medium-security prison, approximately 70 miles north of Manhattan. He arrived in a wheelchair, pushed by Charlene. An oxygen tank was strapped to the back of the wheelchair. Prison officials processed him. He was given a medical evaluation. He was assigned to the prison's medical unit, where inmates with serious health conditions received around-the-clock nursing care. He served exactly 8 weeks. On August 22, 2013, the New York State Division of Parole granted Anthony medical parole. The parole board had met with Anthony on August 21st. They asked about his crimes. Anthony's response, recorded in the parole hearing transcript, was brief. "Well, regrets, yeah. He did not elaborate. He did not apologize. He acknowledged regret, but offered no explanation of what he regretted or why. His extreme frailty, documented by prison medical staff, combined with Parkinson's disease and heart failure, were cited as reasons for release. New York state law permits medical parole for inmates who are so physically or cognitively debilitated or incapacitated that there is a reasonable probability they no longer pose a threat to society. Anthony met those criteria. His lawyers claimed he could not walk, stand, feed himself, or dress himself without assistance. He was released to home confinement with electronic monitoring. Charlene picked him up from Fishkill in a car equipped with wheelchair accessibility. They returned to their apartment in Manhattan. Philip Marshall had expected to inherit approximately $9 million before he testified against his father. The expectation was based on Brooke's original 2002 will, which divided the estate among family and charities. Philip and Alexander were each designated to receive approximately $9 million. After testifying, after the trial, after the estate was finally settled, Philip received $1 million. The reduction reflected the 3 codicils Anthony had convinced Brooke to sign. Codicils that redirected funds away from grandchildren and toward Anthony. When asked about the loss of $8 million, Philip gave an answer that summarized his entire motivation. Basically, we saved my grandmother, and that was my goal. And if it was at the cost of anything I was ever to inherit, I just don't care. He meant it. Friends confirmed that Philip never expressed regret about the money. He had acted out of principle, not greed. After the trial, Philip founded Beyond Brooke, a nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing elder justice and fighting elder abuse. The organization focuses on public education, advocacy for stronger elder abuse laws, and support for families dealing with exploitation of elderly relatives. In 2017, Philip left his tenured professorship at Roger Williams University, a position he had held for over 20 years and which provided financial security and prestige, to work full-time on elder abuse advocacy. He traveled the country speaking at conferences. He testified before state legislatures considering elder abuse legislation. He trained law enforcement and social workers on recognizing signs of exploitation. His vision was that Brooke's case would serve as a catalyst for change, that her unintentional legacy would be protecting others from the fate she suffered. He wanted the case to be remembered not as a story of a wealthy woman exploited by her son, but as a warning about systemic failures that allow elder abuse to flourish. Anthony's final retaliation was complete and cruel. He disinherited both Philip and Alexander entirely in his own will. The will, executed in 2012 while appeals were ongoing, left everything to Charlene. Philip and Alexander, his biological sons, were not mentioned. The document contained a clause specifically noting that the omissions were intentional. Anthony wanted it clear that he was punishing them for their testimony. On November 30th, 2014, Anthony Marshall died at New York Presbyterian Hospital in Manhattan. He was 90 years old. He had been hospitalized 3 days earlier with pneumonia and respiratory failure. His heart was failing. His kidneys were shutting down. Charlene was at his side when he died. The death was announced through a paid obituary placed by Charlene in the New York Times. The obituary, which cost several $1,000s to publish, described Anthony as a very great man. It listed his accomplishments: Purple Heart, 4 ambassadorships, CIA service, Tony Award, degrees from Princeton and Brown. It mentioned only Charlene's children from her previous marriage by name, identifying them as Anthony's beloved stepchildren. The obituary omitted any mention of Anthony's criminal conviction. It omitted any mention of his prison sentence. It omitted any mention of his biological sons, Philip and Alexander. Instead, it presented Anthony as a distinguished public servant and devoted husband. At the bottom, Charlene included a personal message. It was my honor to love and be loved so tenderly by Tony for more than 25 years. Semper Fi, my Toniness. The Marine Corps motto, Semper Fidelis, always faithful, was incongruous given the circumstances. Anthony was buried at Forest Hill Cemetery in Northeast Harbor, Maine, where Charlene's family had a plot. He was not buried next to his mother or next to Vincent Astor. His obituary was his final performance, an attempt to control legacy, to erase crimes, to present a narrative of accomplishment rather than betrayal. Anthony Marshall died believing he had been wronged, his memory defended by an obituary that erased his crimes. Charlene inherited what remained of his share of Brooke's estate. But the question of what would happen to the rest of Brooke Astor's fortune had been settled 2 years earlier, in a final accounting that took 5 years to calculate and negotiate. When Brooke Astor died in August 2007, her estate was valued at approximately $192 million. The valuation included the Park Avenue apartment, Holly Hill, investment portfolios, bank accounts, artwork, jewelry, and furniture. If the 3 codicils Anthony convinced Brooke to sign had stood as written and unchallenged, Anthony would have received over $60 million redirected from charity, plus control over distribution of the entire estate as sole executor. He could have directed additional millions to Charlene. The codicils granted him nearly unlimited discretion. Instead, after years of litigation involving the estate attorneys, the district attorney's office, representatives from charitable institutions, and lawyers for Philip and Alexander, a settlement was reached. Anthony initially inherited $14.5 million under the terms of the revised will, but his criminal conviction opened those assets to restitution claims. After legal fees of $11.6 million, costs associated with defending the criminal case through trial and appeals, and restitution to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office of $12.3 million to cover prosecution costs and ongoing appeal expenses, Anthony's inheritance was reduced to approximately $3 million. The mathematics were brutal. Attempting to steal $60 million cost him $57 million. If he had simply accepted the $14.5 million designated in the original 2002 will and done nothing, he would have died a wealthy man. Instead, greed transformed a fortune into rubble. Estate timing also reduced values. The properties had to be sold to generate liquidity for distributions. The Park Avenue apartment and Holly Hill were listed in 2008, precisely when the real estate market collapsed following the financial crisis. Values plummeted. What might have sold for $70 million in 2006 sold for $30 million in 2011. The charitable institutions that were supposed to inherit tens of millions received less because the estates sold at depressed prices. In March 2012, New York Attorney General Eric Schneiderman announced the final settlement. The announcement was made at a press conference attended by representatives from the major charitable beneficiaries. Approximately $100 million went to charity. The New York Community Trust received $42 million, the largest single distribution. $35 million was designated for the Brooke Astor Fund for NYC education, specifically funding reading programs for elementary school students in underserved neighborhoods. The fund came with a 5-year spending requirement. The money had to be deployed within 5 years, not held in perpetuity. This reflected Brooke's philosophy of active philanthropy. Another $7 million went to education programs throughout New York State with a 1-year spending requirement. The Metropolitan Museum of Art received $20 million. The distribution included $3 million specifically designated for their claim on the lost Hassam painting, partial compensation for an artwork valued at $20 million or more. The remaining $17 million supported curatorial programs, art acquisitions, and conservation work, precisely the areas Brooke had supported during her foundation presidency. The New York Public Library received $15 million. The funds were directed to branch library improvements in the Bronx, Harlem, and other neighborhoods where Brooke had focused her philanthropy. Rockefeller University received $2.6 million for biomedical research. NYU Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development received $2 million for international teacher study trips. Historic Hudson Valley, which maintains historic sites along the Hudson River, received $1.2 million. Other institutions receiving funds included the Brooklyn Museum, Carnegie Hall, the Marine Corps University Foundation in Quantico, Virginia, a nod to Brooke's father's military service, New York Presbyterian Hospital, and the United Nations Foundation. Main charities also benefited, reflecting Brooke's connection to Northeast Harbor, where she had spent summers. The College of the Atlantic received $500,000. Mount Desert Land and Garden Preserve received $100,000 to endow an azalea garden named in Brooke's honor. Northeast Harbor Library received $57,000 for children's programming. The distributions reflected Brooke's values: education, culture, historic preservation, and programs serving disadvantaged populations. family inheritance was limited. Philip Marshall received $1 million after saving his grandmother but losing $8 million in expected inheritance. Alexander Marshall received $1 million. Great-grandchildren received smaller amounts, ranging from $50,000 to $250,000, depending on their ages and Brooke's relationship with them. Anthony's initial $14.5 million was reduced to approximately $3 million after legal costs and restitution, when Anthony died in 2014. Charlene inherited his remaining $14.5 million, the amount Anthony had managed to preserve through trusts established before the criminal trial. This inheritance occurred despite Brooke calling Charlene Miss Piggy and leaving her only jewelry and 2 coats in the original will. Anthony had used his power of attorney to redirect funds to trusts that benefited Charlene indirectly. Those trusts survived the criminal conviction. The Park Avenue apartment at 778 Park. Avenue was listed in 2008 for $46 million. The price reflected comparable sales in the building and the apartment's size and appointments. But the real estate market collapsed that fall. The Co-op Board, which had approval rights over all sales, rejected 2 previous deals at lower prices because the proposed buyers were deemed unsuitable. One was a hedge fund manager whose business practices the board found objectionable. Another was a foreign buyer whose finances raised questions. The apartment finally sold in 2011 for $21 million, less than half the original asking price. The buyer was an undisclosed New York businessman who maintains it as a private residence. The sale price reflected not just market conditions, but also the apartment's condition. It needed extensive renovation work. The urine-stained couch had been removed. But the neglect had caused damage. Floors needed refinishing. Walls needed repainting. The kitchen and bathrooms required updating. The buyer paid $21 million for the bones of a great apartment and spent several million more on renovations. Holly Hill was listed in November 2008 for $12.9 million. The listing described it as a historic estate with sweeping Hudson River views, mature landscaping, and classic architecture. The price reflected comparable estate sales in Westchester County, but the market was terrible. There were no serious offers. The price was dropped to $10.5 million in 2009. Still no serious buyers. It dropped again to $8.5 million in June 2011. Finally, in August 2011, an offer came in at $7.5 million. The estate sold for approximately $7.5 million, less than 60% of the original asking price. Property taxes were $153,000 annually, which limited the buyer pool to very wealthy individuals or institutions. The buyer maintains it privately. It is not open to the public. There are no tours. The new owners have maintained the gardens and restored some of the stonework. But the estate has been removed from public view entirely. In September 2012, Sotheby's Auction House held a 2-day sale of Brooke Astor's personal property. 901 lots from both properties were offered. The sale included furnishings, decorative art, fine art not specifically bequeathed in the will, and jewelry. An 18th-century mahogany dining table sold for $80,000. A set of Qing Dynasty porcelain vases sold for $120,000. A diamond and sapphire bracelet sold for $250,000. The Cartier jade and diamond clock from the library sold for $170,000. Multiple dog portraits sold for prices ranging from $15,000 to $90,000. Reflecting continued collector interest in the genre, the 2-day sale generated approximately $6 million. All proceeds were directed to Brooke's chosen charities, as specified in the settlement agreement. The March 2012 settlement honored Brooke Astor's original intentions. Her money went where she had always planned, to New York's children, to its libraries and museums, to the institutions she had championed for 5 decades. Reading programs in public schools, art conservation at the Met, branch libraries in the Bronx, medical research at Rockefeller. These were the causes Brooke had supported through the Vincent Astor Foundation and through personal gifts. The settlement ensured her legacy would continue. Anthony Marshall's greed had cost him a fortune, but it could not destroy what Brooke had built. The money found its proper home. She did not. The gravestone in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery bears the epitaph Brooke Astor chose. "I had a wonderful life." By most measures, she did. 3 marriages, the first catastrophic, the second happy, the third pragmatic, but productive. A son, twin grandsons, great-grandchildren. 5 decades as New York's most beloved philanthropist. Friends including presidents and first ladies, the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1998. Her name became synonymous with generosity and grace. She transformed the Astor name from robber barons and slumlords into civic benefactors. She moved between penthouse and projects, treating both with equal dignity. But the epitaph was chosen before the final years, before the urine-stained couch, before the torn nightgowns, before the sold painting, before the isolation. Before the systematic theft of everything she had built. More than 2 million Americans aged 65 and older are victimized by elder abuse annually. 60% of elder abuse cases involve family members, children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, caregivers who were once trusted. If it happened to one of America's richest women, surrounded by powerful friends and prominent social connections, it can happen to anyone. Brooke's case became the most publicized elder abuse case in American history. The trial was covered by national media. The details, the couch, the nightgowns, the closed estate, became symbols of how thoroughly someone could be betrayed by the person they trusted most. Philip Marshall founded Beyond Brooke to raise awareness, change laws, and advance elder justice. The organization has trained thousands of social workers, law enforcement officers, and attorneys on recognizing signs of exploitation. It has advocated for stronger elder abuse prosecution. It has supported families facing similar situations. Philip's vision is that this becomes Brooke's lasting legacy beyond the $200 million she gave away during her lifetime, that her suffering prevents others from enduring the same fate. Today, both properties are privately owned and closed to the public. No museums, no tours, accessible only through photographs, auction catalogs, and court documents. The apartments still command millions. The estates still overlook the Hudson. The marble walls still stand on Park Avenue. The stone mansion still overlooks Briarcliff Manor, but the world that created them, where a woman could marry into fortune 3 times, give away $200 million, and still die wealthy, is gone. The world that destroyed her, where power of attorney becomes a weapon, where legal documents enable theft, where family members exploit the vulnerable, remains. Brooke Astor gave away $200 million during her lifetime. That money built libraries, saved museums, preserved parks, helped thousands of people she never met. But the legacy she left unintentionally, the lesson in what happens when power, greed, and family converge, may be equally important. This is what happened to Brooke Astor, a woman who had everything, who gave almost everything away, and who died with almost nothing left to give.